I thought a mother's love could survive anything: betrayal, distance, even death itself. But I never imagined it would have to survive something far more sinister: a calculated plan to erase me from my daughter's life forever, disguised as family devotion. The invitation arrived on cream-colored cardstock with delicate pink roses embossed around the edges, the kind of expensive stationery that whispered old money and social status. "You're invited to celebrate baby Mitchell," it read in elegant script, as Abigail begins her journey into motherhood. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My daughter's name looked so formal written that way, not like the Abby who used to climb into my bed during thunderstorms or spend hours braiding friendship bracelets at our kitchen table. I ran my fingers over the lettering, remembering the day 26 years ago when I'd first held Abigail in my arms at St. Mary's Hospital, just the two of us against the world after her father, Douglas, had walked out when she was 3 months old, claiming he wasn't ready for the responsibility. I'd worked 3 jobs to put her through college: morning shifts, at the diner, afternoons cleaning offices, evenings tutoring students in math. Every sacrifice had been worth it when she graduated summa cum laude with her nursing degree, when she landed her dream job at Children's Hospital, when she met Randy 2 years ago at a medical conference. Randy Mitchell seemed like everything. Douglas hadn't been stable, ambitious, devoted to Abigail. His mother, Clarice, had been charming during their courtship, a silver-haired woman with impeccable taste who spoke of family traditions and proper values. She owned a successful chain of boutique hotels across New England, moved in circles I'd only read about in magazines. When they'd announced their engagement, I'd been thrilled that my daughter would finally have the security and love she deserved. The wedding had been everything Abigail dreamed of: a sprawling estate in the Berkshires, 300 guests, a reception that looked like something from a fairy tale. Clarice had insisted on paying for everything, waving away my offers to contribute with gracious smiles and gentle comments about letting the family handle it. I'd felt grateful then, relieved that my daughter would never know the financial struggles I'd endured. But looking back now, I should have noticed the subtle changes that began almost immediately after the honeymoon. Abigail started missing our weekly Sunday dinners, claiming exhaustion from her new schedule. Our daily phone calls became sporadic, then weekly, then practically non-existent. When I'd express concern, she'd assure me that married life was just different, that Clarice was helping her adjust to being part of the Mitchell family. The pregnancy announcement had come through a formal card in the mail rather than a phone call. Another elegant piece of stationery that felt cold despite its joyful message. I'd called immediately, tears of happiness streaming down my face, but Abigail's response had been strangely muted. "Clarice is helping me plan everything," she'd said when I offered to throw her a baby shower. "She knows all about these things, but of course you're invited, Roberta." Roberta, not Mom. My name spoken with the same polite distance she might use with a coworker or acquaintance. The address on the invitation led me to Clarissa's Beacon Hill mansion, a 4-story brownstone, with windows that sparkled like diamonds in the October sun. I clutched the gift I'd brought, a hand-knitted baby blanket in soft yellow, every stitch sewn during my lunch breaks at the accounting firm where I now worked. It had taken me 2 months to complete, each row a meditation of love for the grandchild I couldn't wait to meet. The front door was answered by a woman in a crisp black uniform who looked at me with barely concealed assessment before leading me through rooms that belonged in a museum. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow prisms across Persian rugs, and oil paintings in gilded frames lined the walls. The living room had been transformed into a baby shower paradise: pink and white balloons, elaborate floral arrangements, a dessert table that looked like it had been catered by the finest bakery in Boston. The guests were all strangers to me. Women in designer dresses with perfect hair and jewelry that caught the light. They spoke in cultured voices about private schools and country clubs, vacation homes in the Hamptons, and skiing in Aspen. I smoothed my department store dress and tried to find a familiar face in the crowd. Then I saw her. Abigail stood near the fireplace, radiant in a flowing lavender dress that emphasized her 6-month bump. Her auburn hair was styled in an elegant updo I'd never seen her wear before, and diamond earrings, ones I didn't recognize, sparkled at her ears. She looked beautiful, sophisticated, like she belonged in this world of wealth and privilege. But when our eyes met across the room, something flickered in her expression. It wasn't joy or love or even the nervous excitement of an expectant mother. It was something I'd never seen in my daughter's eyes before. Something that looked uncomfortably like fear. Clarice appeared beside Abigail almost instantly, her arm sliding around my daughter's shoulders in a gesture that seemed protective, but felt possessive. She whispered something in Abigail's ear, and my daughter's face went pale before she nodded stiffly. I made my way through the crowd, accepting congratulations and making small talk with women whose names I immediately forgot. When I finally reached Abigail, I held out my arms for a hug, but she stepped back slightly, her hands moving protectively to her belly. "Hello, Roberta," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Thank you for coming." The formal words hit me like a physical blow. This was my daughter, the little girl who used to race into my arms after school, who had called me every day during her first week of college because she missed me so much. Now she was greeting me like a polite stranger. "Sweetheart," I said softly. "I've missed you so much. How are you feeling? You look—" "Abigail is feeling wonderful," Clarice interrupted smoothly, her grip on my daughter's shoulder tightening, almost imperceptibly. "We've been taking such good care of her, haven't we, darling? Making sure she has everything she needs for a healthy pregnancy." Something in her tone made my skin crawl, but I forced a smile. "That's wonderful. I'm so grateful. She has such support." Clarice's smile was perfect, practiced, and completely cold. "Family takes care of family, Roberta. That's what we believe in." As the afternoon wore on, I watched Abigail from across the room, noting how she seemed to shrink whenever Clarice approached, how her laughter sounded forced, how she kept glancing toward the door as if looking for an escape route. When other guests asked about the nursery or baby names, it was Clarice who answered, while Abigail stood silently beside her, like a beautiful, silent doll. The final blow came during the gift opening. As Abigail unwrapped present after expensive present, designer baby clothes, luxury strollers, nursery furniture that cost more than my monthly salary, I waited for my turn. When she finally reached my simple yellow blanket, the room fell silent. "How thoughtful," Clarice said, her tone suggesting it was anything but. "Handmade items are so quaint." Abigail's fingers traced the soft wool, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of the daughter I remembered. Her eyes filled with tears, and she opened her mouth as if to say something. Then Clarice cleared her throat, and whatever moment we might have had was lost. What happened next would replay in my mind for months, each detail burned into my memory with crystalline clarity. Clarice rose from her chair with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to commanding attention, her silk dress catching the afternoon light streaming through the tall windows. She moved to stand behind Abigail, her manicured hands settling on my daughter's shoulders like a claim of ownership. "Ladies," Clarice announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never been ignored. "Before we continue with our celebration, I believe it's time for a very special announcement." The conversations around the room died instantly. 25 pairs of eyes turned toward the fireplace where my daughter sat, surrounded by torn wrapping paper and expensive gifts. I noticed how Abigail's hands trembled slightly as they rested on her belly, how her breathing had become shallow and quick. "As you all know," Clarice continued, her voice warm with what sounded like maternal pride, "welcoming a baby into our family is about more than just the precious child we're expecting. It's about understanding what it truly means to be a mother, to be part of a legacy that spans generations." I felt a chill creep up my spine, though I couldn't yet understand why. Around me, the other guests nodded appreciatively, their faces showing the kind of polite attention reserved for speeches at formal events. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Abigail has been on quite a journey these past months, Clarice said, her hands tightening almost imperceptibly on my daughter's shoulders. Learning about our family traditions, understanding the responsibilities that come with raising a Mitchell heir, discovering what real maternal guidance looks like. The words hit me like ice water. I opened my mouth to speak, but Clarice's voice rose slightly, drowning out any response I might have made. And today, on this beautiful afternoon surrounded by the women who truly matter in her life, Abigail wants to share something very important with all of you. She looked down at my daughter with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Don't you, darling? Abigail's face had gone completely white. She looked up at Clarice, then around the room at all the expectant faces, and finally, her gaze landed on me. In that moment, I saw my daughter's internal struggle playing out across her features. Fear, warring with something that might have been defiance, love battling against what looked like programmed obedience. Abigail's voice was barely a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again. I want everyone to know that I'm so grateful for all the love and support I've received. Tell them what we discussed, sweetheart, Clarice prompted, her voice gentle but with an undertone of steel that made my blood run cold. Abigail stood slowly, her movements careful and deliberate. When she spoke again, her voice was stronger, but it carried a rehearsed quality that broke my heart. These past few months have been enlightening, she said, the words seeming to stick in her throat. I've learned so much about what it means to be part of a real family, to have proper guidance during this important time in my life. She paused, her eyes finding mine across the room. For a split second, I saw an apology there, a plea for understanding that she couldn't voice aloud. I want to introduce you all to someone very special, Abigail continued, her voice growing steadier, as if she was reading from a script she'd memorized. The woman who has shown me what true motherhood looks like, who has guided me through the most important decisions of my life, who has opened her heart and her home to me in ways I never knew were possible. My heart began to pound as I realized where this was heading, but I still couldn't quite believe it. This is my real mom, Abigail said, placing her hand over Clarice's where it rested on her shoulder. The woman who has taught me what family really means, what sacrifice looks like, what unconditional love feels like. Clarice Mitchell, my true mother. The room erupted in gentle applause and murmurs of approval. I felt the air leave my lungs as if I'd been physically struck. Around me, faces turned toward me with expressions ranging from curiosity to pity, to barely concealed judgment. And this, Abigail continued, her voice now trembling with what I recognized as forced composure, is Roberta Campbell. She was very important during my childhood, of course. She provided for me in the ways she was able, and I'm grateful for that care during my formative years. The dismissal in her words was like a knife to my chest. Formative years. Care. As if 26 years of love, sacrifice, midnight fevers, homework help, college tuition, and unconditional support could be reduced to mere care during formative years. But now, Abigail said, and I could see tears building in her eyes even as she forced the words out. Now I understand what real maternal love looks like. Clarice has shown me stability, guidance, and the kind of sophistication I need to raise my child properly. She's helped me understand that there's a difference between someone who merely provides basic care and someone who truly nurtures your growth as a person. Clarice's smile was radiant with triumph. Thank you, darling. You know how much you mean to me, to all of us. You've become the daughter I always dreamed of having. I stood there in my department store dress, clutching my small purse, feeling like I was drowning in a room full of air. The other guests had resumed their conversations, some shooting sympathetic glances in my direction, others avoiding eye contact altogether. I realized that this moment had been planned, choreographed, designed to humiliate me in front of an audience of strangers. But even in my shock, even as my heart shattered into pieces, I noticed things. I noticed how Abigail couldn't quite meet my eyes after her speech. I noticed the way her hands shook as she accepted congratulations from the other guests. I noticed how Clarice never once moved away from her side, like a guard dog protecting its territory. Most importantly, I noticed the moment when Abigail mouthed a single word to me across the room, so quickly and quietly that I almost missed. "I'm sorry." That tiny word, that split second of connection, told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't really my daughter speaking. This was a performance, forced and rehearsed and painful for her to deliver. I managed to summon a smile, a real one, because for the first time since entering this house, I felt a spark of hope. My daughter was still in there somewhere, buried, under layers of manipulation and control, but still fighting. "Thank you for including me today," I said to the room, my voice surprisingly steady. "Family is indeed precious, isn't it? And real love. Well, real love has a way of surviving even the most challenging circumstances." Clarice's eyes narrowed slightly at my words, but her smile never wavered. How lovely. Family bonds are so important to maintain, aren't they? As I gathered my coat and prepared to leave, I caught Abigail's eye one more time. This time, I was the one who mouthed a message. "I'm here." Her face crumpled for just an instant before she turned away, but I'd seen enough. The war for my daughter's soul was far from over. I drove home in a daze, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles had turned white. The October afternoon that had started with such promise now felt gray and cold, matching the hollow ache that had settled in my chest. Every few blocks, I had to pull over as waves of emotion threatened to overwhelm me. Grief, confusion, and something that felt dangerously close to rage. The words kept echoing in my mind. She provided for me in the ways she was able. 26. Years of my life reduced to basic provision, as if I were some distant caretaker rather than the woman who had held her through countless nightmares, celebrated every small victory, and worked myself to exhaustion to give her opportunities I'd never had. My small apartment felt impossibly quiet when I finally made it home. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Abigail had done her homework every night, where we'd planned her college applications, where she'd told me about Randy with stars in her eyes, and tried to make sense of what had just happened. Pulled out the photo album I kept on the counter, flipping through years of memories that now felt like evidence of a life that had been erased. There was Abigail at 5, gap-toothed and grinning as she presented me with a Mother's Day card made from construction paper and covered in glitter. At 12, awkward in her school uniform but beaming after making honor roll. At 18, crying, happy tears in her graduation cap as I pinned her Honor Society cord to her gown. At 22, calling me from the hospital after her first day as a pediatric nurse. "Mom, I saved a life today. I actually helped save a little boy's life. I couldn't have done any of this without you." That voice, those words, they belonged to my real daughter. Not the polished stranger who had dismissed our entire relationship in front of a room full of society matrons. I tried calling her cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. The message I heard made my blood run cold. "You've reached Abigail Mitchell. I'm unavailable to take your call, but if this is regarding family matters, please contact Clarice Mitchell directly at..." It wasn't even Abigail's voice on the recording. It was a professional, impersonal message that sounded like it belonged to a business rather than my daughter's personal phone. When had she changed her voicemail? When had she started directing family calls to her mother-in-law? I tried the house phone next, but Randy answered with a voice that was carefully neutral. "Hello, Mrs. Campbell. Abigail is resting right now. The baby shower was quite exhausting. For her?" Randy. I just need to talk to her for a minute. I'm worried about— I think it's best if we give her some space, he interrupted. And there was something in his tone that sounded rehearsed, like he'd been coached on what to say. Today was emotionally challenging for everyone. Perhaps you could try calling next week. Next week. As if I were a distant acquaintance requesting a social call rather than a mother concerned about her daughter. Randy, this is ridiculous. Something is wrong. Abigail would never— The line went dead. I sat staring at the phone, feeling like I'd fallen into some alternate reality where nothing made sense. I thought about the daughter I'd raised, strong-willed, independent, fiercely loyal. The girl who had defended me against her father's family when they'd criticized my lifestyle choices after the divorce. The woman who had hugged me so tightly after her nursing graduation that I thought she might crack my ribs. That woman wouldn't have humiliated me in public unless something was terribly wrong. I started a timeline, writing down everything I could remember about the changes in Abigail's behavior over the past year. The shift had been so gradual that I hadn't noticed it at first, like watching someone slowly disappear piece by piece. It had started right after the honeymoon. Abigail had returned from their trip to Europe different somehow, quieter. She'd mentioned that Clarice had arranged for them to stay in her family's villa in Tuscany, that she'd spent time learning about proper entertaining and social expectations. At the time, I'd thought it was sweet that she was trying to fit into Randy's world. Then came the missed Sunday dinners. For 18 years, through high school, college, and her early career, Abigail had religiously kept our Sunday tradition. Even when she was dating or working extra shifts, she'd make time for our weekly catch-up over homemade pasta and cheap wine. But after the marriage, the excuses had started. Randy's family had a standing Sunday brunch. Clarice needed help with a charity event. They had social obligations. The phone calls had been next. My daughter, who used to call me during her commute, during her lunch breaks, whenever she saw something funny that reminded her of me, had gradually become impossible to reach. When I did manage to connect with her, our conversations felt stilted, formal, like she was reading from a script. I remembered the last real conversation we'd had about 3 months ago. I'd been telling her about a difficult patient at work, an elderly man whose family never visited, and Abigail had started crying. "Mom, you work so hard taking care of everyone else. Who takes care of you?" It was such a quintessentially Abigail question, always worried about others, always putting family first. But when I'd suggested that maybe we could have dinner just the two of us, she'd quickly backtracked. I should probably check with Randy first. And Clarice likes to know our schedule in advance. She worries when she doesn't know where we are. At the time, I'd thought it was considerate of her to keep her new family informed. Now, it sounded like something else entirely. I pulled out my laptop and did something I'd never thought I'd need to do. I started researching psychological manipulation and family control. What I found made my stomach turn. Article after article about isolation tactics, about how abusers slowly separated their victims from support systems, about the gradual erosion of identity that could happen so slowly that even the victim didn't notice until it was too late. The pregnancy had accelerated everything. Abigail had mentioned that Clarice insisted on being involved in all the medical appointments, that she'd helpfully taken over the planning for everything baby-related. She'd moved them into a house just 2 streets away from her own mansion, claiming she wanted to be close to help with the baby. What I'd seen as generous support now looked like something far more sinister. Systematic isolation disguised as family. Devotion. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Roberta, this is Judy from the baby shower today. I hope you don't mind that I got your number from the guest list. Could we meet for coffee sometime? I'd like to talk to you about something important." I stared at the message, trying to place the name and face. Then I remembered a quiet woman in her 50s who had watched the entire scene at the baby shower with a troubled expression. She'd been the only guest who hadn't applauded when Abigail made her announcement. I typed back immediately, "Yes." When and where? Her response came within minutes. "Tomorrow, 2 p.m., Coffee Bean on Newbury Street. Come alone. There are things you need to know about Clarice Mitchell." As I set the phone down, I felt the first spark of hope I'd experienced since leaving the baby shower. Someone else had seen what I'd seen. Someone else knew that something was wrong. I looked at the photo album again, stopping at a picture of Abigail and me from last Christmas. We were laughing at something ridiculous, probably one of my terrible jokes, and her arm was wrapped around my shoulders in casual affection. That was my real daughter, and somehow, some way, I was going to get her back. The Coffee Bean on Newbury. Street was crowded with the usual mix of college students and business people, but I spotted Judy immediately. She sat in a corner booth, her hands wrapped around a mug as if seeking warmth, her eyes scanning the room with the nervous energy of someone who had something important to say but wasn't sure how to begin. As I approached, she looked up with relief. "Roberta, thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." I slid into the booth across from her, studying her face more carefully than I'd been able to at the baby shower. Judy had the kind of understated elegance that spoke of old money, pearl, earrings, a cashmere sweater, a simple but expensive handbag. But there was something haunted in her eyes that suggested she'd seen more than her share of pain. "You said there were things I needed to know about Clarice," I said without preamble. "I'm listening." Judy glanced around the coffee shop again, then leaned forward slightly. "What I'm about to tell you, it's not gossip or speculation. My daughter was married to Clarice's nephew, Arthur, for 3 years, was being the operative phrase. Something cold settled in my stomach. What happened? Arthur was a lovely boy, really. Sensitive, artistic, wanted to be a photographer rather than go into the family business. Clarice couldn't stand that he wouldn't conform to her vision of what a Mitchell man should be." Judy's voice was barely above a whisper. She convinced his parents that he needed to marry someone who would stabilize him, help him grow up, and take responsibility. I thought about Randy, about his quiet demeanor at family gatherings, the way he seemed to defer to Clarice on everything from restaurant choices to vacation plans. "And your daughter was chosen for this role?" "Exactly. Sarah was perfect for Clarice's purposes, young, impressionable, from a middle-class family that was grateful for the Mitchell connection. Just like your Abigail." Judy's hands tightened around her mug. For the first year, everything seemed wonderful. Sarah thought she'd won the lottery, married into wealth, had a mother-in-law who seemed devoted to her success and happiness. Seemed being the key word. Clarice has a very specific method. She starts by showering her targets with attention and gifts, making them feel special and chosen. She positions herself as a mentor, someone who can guide them to their full potential. She's very good at identifying what people want most and convincing them that she's the key to getting it. I thought about Abigail's childhood dreams of having a traditional family, of belonging somewhere stable and established. After growing up with just me, struggling financially, she'd always been drawn to the idea of being part of something bigger, more secure. "Then comes the isolation," Judy continued. "It's subtle at first. Suggestions that old friends are holding you back, that your family doesn't understand your new life. She creates situations where you have to choose between your old life and your new one, and she makes the choice seem obvious." My mind raced back to all the missed dinners, the canceled plans, the way Abigail had gradually become unavailable for our traditions. She makes them feel guilty for maintaining outside relationships. Exactly. And once the isolation is complete, she begins the real work, reshaping their identity to fit her vision. Sarah went from being a confident, independent young woman to someone who couldn't make a decision without Clarice's approval. She quit her job, cut ties with her college friends, even stopped calling me except for formal occasions. How long did this take? About 18 months. By the end, Sarah felt like she owed Clarice everything: her marriage, her social status, her entire sense of self-worth. When I tried to express concern, Sarah defended Clarice fiercely, said I was jealous and didn't understand sophisticated family dynamics. The parallels to Abigail's behavior were chilling. What happened to Arthur in all this? Judy's face darkened. Arthur tried to fight it at first. He could see what was happening to Sarah, how she was changing. But Clarice had been working on him his whole life, and she knew exactly which buttons to push. She convinced him that if he really loved Sarah, he'd support her transformation into a proper Mitchell wife. She made him feel like his concerns were selfish and immature. So he went along with it? He had to, or risk losing everything: his trust fund, his place in the family, his wife. Clarice is very good at creating situations where resistance feels impossible. Judy paused to sip her coffee, her hands still, trembling slightly. The breaking point came when Sarah got pregnant. My blood turned to ice. What do you mean? Clarice insisted on controlling every aspect of the pregnancy: the doctor, the birthing plan, even the name of the baby. She moved them into a house right next to hers, claimed it was to help with the baby care. Sarah was so grateful for the support that she didn't realize she'd become a prisoner in her own life. And then, Sarah lost the baby at 7 months, a stillbirth that the doctor said was unexplainable. Everything had been progressing normally. Judy's voice broke slightly, but in her grief, Sarah started asking questions about the medications Clarice had been giving her, the special vitamins and supplements that were supposedly better than what her original doctor had prescribed. I felt nauseous. You think Clarice... I think Clarice saw the baby as a threat to her control over Sarah and Arthur. A child would have created bonds that even she couldn't manipulate. When Sarah started investigating, started demanding to see medical records, Clarice convinced Arthur that his wife was having a nervous breakdown due to grief. They had her committed? Worse, they convinced her she was losing her mind. Clarice brought in a psychiatrist who specialized in treating difficult, wealthy family members. Sarah was prescribed medications that made her foggy and compliant. Within 6 months, she'd agreed to a divorce, signed away any claim to the Mitchell assets, and moved across the country to start fresh. I sat in stunned silence, processing the implications. If Judy was right, Clarice wasn't just controlling, she was dangerous. And Abigail, with her pregnancy and her gradual isolation from me, was following the exact same pattern. Why are you telling me this? I asked finally. Because when I saw what happened at that baby shower yesterday, I saw Sarah all over again, the fear in your daughter's eyes, the rehearsed speech, the way Clarice positioned herself as the savior. Judy reached across the table and gripped my hand. And because I couldn't save my daughter, but maybe together we can save yours. What happened to Sarah? Where is she now? Judy's smile was sad but proud. She's doing well, actually. It took years of therapy, but she rebuilt her life. She's a teacher in Oregon now, married to a wonderful man who loves her for exactly who she is. But she lost so much time, so much of herself. She leaned forward intently. We can't let that happen to Abigail. I felt a surge of determination unlike anything I'd ever experienced. What do? We gather evidence. We document everything. And we find a way to show Abigail the truth before it's too late. Judy pulled out a business card. This is my lawyer. She specializes in cases involving financial and psychological abuse within wealthy families. She knows Clarice's methods. As I took the card, I realized that I was no longer fighting this battle alone. For the first time, the lawyer's office was in a converted brownstone in Back Bay, the kind of discreet location where Boston's elite handled their most sensitive matters. Margaret Torres had the sharp eyes and careful demeanor of someone who'd spent decades navigating the treacherous waters of wealthy family dynamics. Her office walls were lined with degrees from Harvard Law and case files that probably contained enough secrets to topple half the social register. "Judy filled me in on the basics," Margaret said, gesturing for me to take a seat across from her mahogany desk. "But I need to hear everything from your perspective. Start from the beginning." I spent the next hour recounting every detail I could. Remember? Abigail's gradual transformation, the missed calls, the changed voicemail, the humiliation at the baby shower. Margaret took notes in a precise shorthand, occasionally asking clarifying questions that made me realize how much I'd dismissed as normal when it was anything but. "The pattern is consistent with what I've seen in other cases involving Clarice Mitchell," Margaret said when I finished. "She's been perfecting these techniques for years, and she's very good at staying just on the right side of legal boundaries." "Just barely legal doesn't make it right," I said, frustration creeping into my voice. "No, it doesn't, but it makes our job more difficult." Margaret leaned back in her chair, studying me carefully. "How far are you willing to go to save your daughter?" "As far as necessary." "Even if it means potentially exposing yourself to civil liability? Even if it means your relationship with Abigail might get worse before it gets better?" I thought about the fear I'd seen in my daughter's eyes, about Judy's story of what had happened to Sarah. "Yes," Margaret nodded approvingly. "Good, because what I'm about to suggest isn't exactly orthodox." She pulled out a thick file from her desk drawer. "I've been tracking Clarice's activities for several years now, ever since the Sarah situation. There have been other cases, not just daughters-in-law, but business partners, employees, even family members who found themselves gradually stripped of their independence and assets. She's done this to other people? At least 6 that I can document, probably more that never came to light. Clarice has a gift for identifying vulnerable people and convincing them that they need her guidance to succeed. She particularly targets women who come from modest backgrounds but have married or worked their way into her social circle." Margaret opened the file, revealing photographs, financial documents, and what looked like medical records. "The problem is that most of her victims are too isolated or too financially dependent on her to fight back. By the time they realize what's happened, they've lost the resources and support systems they'd need to resist." "But you've been building a case anyway?" "I've been documenting patterns, yes, waiting for the right opportunity to act." She looked at me intently. "Your daughter's situation might be that opportunity, especially with the pregnancy involved. Family court judges take a very dim view of psychological manipulation when there's an unborn child at risk." I felt a surge of hope. "What do you need from me?" "Evidence, concrete documentation of the control and isolation tactics, phone records, financial statements, medical records if possible. And most importantly, we need to establish that Abigail is being coerced rather than making free choices." "How do we do that?" Margaret smiled for the first time since I'd entered her office. "We're going to use one of Clarice's own tactics against her. We're going to create a situation where she reveals her true methods in a way that can be documented." She pulled out what looked like a small jewelry box from her desk drawer. "This is a recording device. State-of-the-art, completely undetectable when worn properly. My investigator uses them for domestic abuse cases where traditional evidence gathering isn't possible." I stared at the device, understanding immediately what she was suggesting. "You want me to secretly record Clarice. I want you to have a conversation with her about your concerns regarding Abigail. Based on her psychological profile, she won't be able to resist the opportunity to gloat about her success and explain why you're unfit to be in your daughter's life. People like Clarice have an almost compulsive need to justify their actions and demonstrate their superiority. And if she doesn't take the bait, then we try a different approach. But in my experience, narcissists can rarely resist the chance to prove how much smarter they are than everyone else." Margaret's expression grew serious. "But Roberta, you need to understand the risks. If Clarice suspects what you're doing, she could escalate her control over Abigail, She might move them away, cut off all communication, or even convince Randy to seek a restraining order against you. I thought about my daughter's terrified eyes, about the apology she'd mouthed at the baby shower, about Judy's daughter who'd lost everything. What's the alternative? Sit back and watch Clarice destroy my daughter's life? No. But I want you to be fully informed about what we're facing. Margaret handed me another business card. This is Dr. Elena Rodriguez. She's a forensic psychologist who specializes in cases involving psychological manipulation and coercive control. I want you to meet with her before we proceed. Why? Because if this goes to court, we'll need expert testimony about the psychological techniques Clarice uses. But more importantly, Dr. Rodriguez can help you understand what Abigail is going through mentally and emotionally. The more you understand about the psychological dynamics at play, the better chance you'll have of reaching your daughter when the time comes. I took both cards, feeling the weight of what we were planning. How long do we have? Based on the timeline Judy described with Sarah, and the fact that Abigail is 6 months pregnant, I'd estimate we have maybe 8 to 10 weeks before Clarice makes her final move. Once the baby is born, her control will be complete. A new mother, isolated from her support system, financially dependent, and bonded to a child that Clarice will position herself as the primary caregiver for. It would be nearly impossible to break that hold. The timeline sent a chill through me. 10 weeks to save my daughter and grandchild from a woman who had been perfecting these techniques for years. There's something else, Margaret said quietly. Something I haven't told Judy because I didn't want to traumatize her further. What? Sarah wasn't Clarice's only victim to lose a pregnancy. There was another case, about 5 years ago, a business partner's daughter who was being groomed to marry into the family. She also had an unexplained late-term pregnancy loss after being under Clarice's care. The implication hit me like a physical blow. You think she's deliberately causing these losses? I think Clarice sees babies as threats to her control, and I think she's willing to take extreme measures to eliminate those threats, which means your daughter and grandchild are in more danger than we initially realized. I stood up, clutching the recording device and business cards. Then we better work fast. As I left Margaret's office, I realized that what had started as a fight to restore my relationship with my daughter had become something much more urgent. A race against time to save 2 lives. Dr. Elena Rodriguez's office felt more like a cozy living room than a clinical space, with warm lighting and comfortable chairs that invited honesty. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe 45, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the patient demeanor of someone who'd heard every possible variation of human manipulation and control. Margaret briefed me on your situation, she said, settling into her chair with a notepad. Before we discuss your daughter specifically, I want you to understand what we're dealing with when we talk about someone like Clarice Mitchell. Pulled out a thick folder and opened it to reveal what looked like a psychological profile. I've been studying Clarice's methods for 3 years now, ever since the Sarah case. What makes her particularly dangerous is that she's not acting out of mental illness or emotional instability. This is calculated, systematic psychological warfare designed to achieve specific goals, which are control, primarily, but also validation of her superiority and the accumulation of power within her social sphere. She targets women who represent what she sees as threats to her dominance. Young, attractive, accomplished women who might challenge her position as the matriarch of her family or social circle. Dr. Rodriguez showed me a timeline chart. Her methods follow a predictable pattern that typically takes 18 to 24 months to complete. First comes the love bombing phase, excessive attention, gifts, flattery, positioning herself as a mentor and benefactor. I thought about the expensive wedding, the house purchase, all the ways Clarice had helped Abigail and Randy get started in their marriage. Phase 2 is isolation, she continued. This is done gradually and with Plausible explanations. Old friends are portrayed as jealous or holding the victim back. Family members are depicted as not understanding the victim's new elevated status. Work colleagues are seen as unprofessional or unsuitable for someone in the victim's position. And the victim goes along with this? Because it's presented as caring guidance from someone who wants what's best for them. Clarice is very skilled at identifying each person's deepest insecurities and desires, then positioning herself as the solution. Dr. Rodriguez turned to another page. For your daughter, I suspect it was the promise of the stable, traditional family she never had growing up. The accuracy of that assessment was painful. Abigail had always been sensitive about having a single mother, about our financial struggles, about feeling like an outsider when her friends talked about family vacations and stable home lives. Phase 3 is dependency creation, Dr. Rodriguez continued. The victim's sense of self-worth becomes entirely tied to Clarice's approval. They lose the ability to make decisions independently because they've been conditioned to believe that Clarice knows best about everything. How does she do that? Through a combination of intermittent reinforcement, sometimes showering them with praise, sometimes withdrawing approval, and gaslighting. She'll make statements or decisions, then later deny them or claim the victim misunderstood. Over time, the victim stops trusting their own memory and judgment. I remembered Abigail's confusion during our last few conversations, how she'd seemed uncertain about things she'd previously been confident about, how she'd deferred to what Clarice thinks on topics where she'd once had strong opinions. The final phase is what I call identity replacement, Dr. Rodriguez said grimly. By this point, the victim's original personality, goals, and relationships have been systematically dismantled and replaced with a version that serves Clarice's purposes. The person they used to be essentially ceases to exist. But surely there's some part of them that resists, that remembers who they were? There is, which is why Clarice works so hard to eliminate any reminders of the victim's former life. It's also why the pregnancy represents such a critical juncture. She leaned forward intently. A baby creates new emotional bonds that even Clarice can't completely control. The maternal instinct can sometimes break through the conditioning. Is that why you think she's been causing pregnancy losses? Dr. Rodriguez nodded gravely. I've reviewed the medical records from both Sarah's case and the other incident Margaret mentioned. In both situations, the women were taking supplements and medications prescribed by physicians that Clarice had personally recommended. Both had unexplained complications that led to late-term losses. You're saying she's killing babies? I'm saying she's creating medical situations that result in pregnancy loss, then positioning herself as the primary source of comfort and support during the grieving process. It's the ultimate act of control. She eliminates the threat, then becomes the savior who helps the victim through their tragedy. The room felt like it was spinning. How is she not in prison? Because she's very careful to maintain plausible deniability. The medications and supplements she recommends are typically from physicians she has financial relationships with, doctors who've received donations from her charitable foundation, or who treat her social circle exclusively. The pregnancy losses appear to be natural complications, not intentional harm. Dr. Rodriguez showed me another document. But there's something else you need to understand about the timeline we're facing. Based on the pattern I've observed, Clarice typically escalates her control during the 3rd trimester of pregnancy. She uses the physical vulnerability and emotional intensity of late pregnancy to push through major life changes. What kind of changes? Relocation, usually. She'll convince the couple that they need to move somewhere more suitable for raising a child, often to a property she owns or controls. She'll arrange for new medical care, new social circles, complete geographic isolation from any remaining support systems. My heart stopped. Has she suggested anything like that to Abigail and Randy? I don't know, but based on her historical pattern, if she hasn't yet, she will soon. The move typically happens around the 7th or 8th month of pregnancy, when the woman is too physically and emotionally vulnerable to resist effectively. Dr. Rodriguez closed the folder and looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and urgency. Roberta, I want you to understand something. Your daughter is not weak or stupid for falling into this situation. Clarice's methods are sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques that would be effective against most people, especially someone with Abigail's particular vulnerabilities. Then how do we fight her? By understanding that this is essentially a deprogramming situation. Your daughter has been systematically conditioned to believe that Clarice is her primary source of safety, love, and guidance. Breaking that conditioning requires patience, evidence, and most importantly, demonstrating that there's a safer, more authentic alternative. She handed me a book on psychological manipulation and recovery. I want you to read this before we proceed with any direct action. The more you understand about what Abigail is experiencing internally, the better chance you'll have of reaching her when the time comes. How much time do we have? If my analysis is correct, and if Clarice follows her usual pattern, you have maybe 6 weeks before she makes her move to relocate them. Once that happens, recovering your daughter becomes exponentially more difficult. As I left Dr. Rodriguez's office, clutching the book and recording device, I felt the full weight of what we were up against. This wasn't just a family dispute or a misunderstanding that could be resolved with honest conversation. This was a calculated attack on my daughter's very identity, orchestrated by a woman who had perfected the art of psychological destruction. But for the first time since the baby shower, I also felt something else. Understanding. I finally knew what we were fighting, and that meant we could develop a strategy to win. I spent that night reading Dr. Rodriguez's book cover to cover, taking notes and highlighting passages that felt like descriptions of my own daughter's transformation. By dawn, I understood with chilling clarity that Abigail was in immediate physical danger, not just emotional or psychological harm. The chapter on induced dependency and medical control was particularly horrifying. It described how sophisticated manipulators used medical authority figures to create artificial health crises that increased their victims' vulnerability and dependence. The case studies included women who'd been convinced they needed medications for conditions they didn't have, who'd undergone unnecessary procedures, who'd experienced complications that mysteriously resolved once their manipulator had achieved their goals. I called Margaret Torres at 7 a.m., not caring if I woke her up. "We need to move faster," I said without preamble. "I think Abigail is in immediate physical danger." "What's changed?" I spent the night reading about medical manipulation tactics. If Clarice is following the pattern Dr. Rodriguez described, she's probably already started introducing medications or treatments that will create pregnancy complications. My voice was shaking with fear and rage. We need to find out what supplements or medications Clarice has been giving her. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say," Margaret replied, her voice alert despite the early hour. "Because I got a call yesterday evening that changes everything. One of my investigative contacts has been monitoring financial transactions related to Clarice's charitable foundation. There's been a significant payment to a pharmaceutical company that specializes in fertility and pregnancy medications." "What kind of payment?" $500,000 listed as a research donation. But when my contact dug deeper, she found that the company has been supplying custom compounded medications to Dr. Harrison Wilkins, who happens to be Abigail's new obstetrician. I felt my blood turn to ice. The doctor Clarice chose for her. Exactly. And Dr. Wilkins has an interesting history. He's been investigated twice by the medical board for unusual patient outcomes, but both investigations were dropped after substantial donations were made to the board's educational foundation. By Clarice? By shell companies that trace back to her business interests. This woman has been buying medical silence for years. Margaret's voice hardened. "Roberta, I think we need to accelerate our timeline. If Clarice is planning to induce pregnancy complications, waiting 6 weeks might be too late. I thought about the fear in Abigail's eyes, about her increasingly frail appearance at the baby shower. What do you need me to do? We need that recording of Clarice, and we need it within the next week. But more importantly, we need to find a way to get Abigail away from Dr. Wilkins and back to legitimate medical care. How do we do that without tipping off Clarice? We don't. We're past the point of subtlety. Margaret's tone was grim but determined. I'm going to file an emergency motion for a psychological evaluation and temporary protective custody. It's a long shot, but if we can demonstrate that Abigail is being subjected to coercive control and medical manipulation, a judge might be willing to intervene. What about Randy? Won't he fight it? That's where it gets complicated. I've been researching Randy's background, and I think he might be as much a victim as Abigail. Clarice has been controlling his life since childhood. His father died when he was 12, and Clarice became his sole guardian. She's been managing his trust fund, his career choices, even his living arrangements for over 15 years. This was a new piece of the puzzle I hadn't considered. You think he doesn't realize what his mother is doing? I think he's been conditioned, from childhood, to believe that questioning Clarice's judgment is not just wrong, but dangerous. She probably convinced him that his father's death was somehow connected to not following family guidance properly. I remembered Randy's nervous demeanor at family gatherings, how he always looked to Clarice before expressing any opinion, how he seemed more like an employee than a son. So he's not a willing participant in this? He's a victim who's been turned into an unwitting accomplice, which means that if we can reach him with the right information, he might become an ally instead of an obstacle. Margaret paused, and I could hear papers shuffling in the background. There's something else. My investigator managed to get access to the Mitchell family's private medical records through a contact at their insurance company. Randy has been on anti-anxiety medication for the past 10 years, prescribed by the same Dr. Wilkins who's treating Abigail. For anxiety? For what Dr. Wilkins diagnosed as chronic anxiety disorder related to family trauma. But here's the interesting part. Randy's medical records show no history of anxiety problems before his relationship with Dr. Wilkins began. In fact, his school and college records describe him as confident and outgoing. The implications were staggering. She's been drugging her own son? I think she's been using medication to keep him compliant and dependent. Low-dose anti-anxiety medications can create a fog-like mental state that makes independent thinking and decision-making much more difficult. It's a form of chemical control. I thought about Randy's flat effect, his seemingly glazed responses to direct questions, the way he seemed to drift through conversations without fully engaging. I'd attributed it to shyness or introversion, but what if it was something more sinister? If Randy is being medicated against his will, could we use that to get him to help us? Possibly. But we'd need to get him away from his medication enough for the fog to clear, and we'd need to present him with evidence that he could understand and accept. Margaret's voice carried a note of warning. And we'd need to be very careful. If Clarice suspects that Randy is becoming unreliable, she might escalate her timeline dramatically. What do you mean? I mean, she might decide that the current situation is too unstable to continue. She could force an immediate relocation, or worse, she could accelerate whatever medical complications she's planning to induce. The weight of the decision pressed down on me. Every choice carried enormous risks, but inaction carried the greatest risk of all. There's one more thing, Margaret said quietly. My investigator found evidence that Clarice has been making arrangements to purchase a property in Switzerland, a private medical facility that specializes in treating what they call difficult family situations. She's planning to take them out of the country? It looks that way. The purchase is scheduled to close in 3 weeks, which means she's probably planning to move them there sometime in the next month. Switzerland, beyond the reach of American law enforcement, beyond any chance of intervention or rescue. Once Clarice got Abigail there, especially if pregnancy complications required ongoing medical care, it would be nearly impossible to get her back. Margaret, we can't wait for the recording or the court motion. We need to act now. I agree. But we need to be smart about it. One mistake, and we lose any chance of saving either of them. As I hung up the phone, I realized that the situation had evolved far beyond what any of us had initially understood. This wasn't just about saving my daughter from psychological manipulation. It was about preventing what amounted to kidnapping and potentially murder, orchestrated by a woman with unlimited resources and years of experience covering her tracks. The recording device sat on my kitchen table like a small bomb, waiting to be deployed. But I was beginning to think that subtle evidence gathering wasn't going to be enough to stop what Clarice had set in motion. Sometimes, desperate situations called for desperate measures. The plan we devised was risky, but it was our only chance to reach both Abigail and Randy before Clarice could move them to Switzerland. Margaret had discovered that Clarice had a standing appointment every Thursday afternoon at an exclusive spa in downtown Boston, a 3-hour session that she never missed or rescheduled. This would give us our only window of opportunity to approach Randy and Abigail without Clarice's immediate interference. I spent Tuesday and Wednesday conducting surveillance, something I never thought I'd find myself doing at 52 years old. I positioned myself in a coffee shop across from Randy's office building, timing his lunch breaks and noting his routines. He left the building every day at exactly 12:30, walked to the same sandwich shop 2 blocks away, and returned within 30 minutes. His movements were predictable, almost robotic, which Margaret said was consistent with someone whose initiative had been systematically suppressed. On Thursday morning, I waited in the sandwich shop, my heart pounding as I rehearsed. What I would say, the recording device was hidden in a brooch on my jacket, and I carried a manila envelope containing copies of the financial documents Margaret had uncovered about Dr. Wilkins and the Swiss medical facility. Randy entered at 12:32, just as I'd predicted. Up close, I could see how much he'd changed since the wedding. He'd lost weight, his skin had a grayish pallor, and his eyes had the unfocused quality I now recognized as a side effect of long-term anxiety medication. He moved through the sandwich line like he was sleepwalking. "Randy?" I approached him as he waited for his order. "It's Roberta, Abigail's mother." He turned slowly, blinking as if trying to bring me into focus. "Oh. Hello, Mrs. Campbell." His voice was flat, emotionless. "I didn't expect to see you here. I was hoping we could talk. About Abigail." Something flickered in his eyes. Fear, maybe, or confusion. "I don't think. Mother says it's better if we don't." He trailed off, looking around the restaurant nervously. "Randy, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Your mother isn't here. It's just you and me, and I have something important to show you about your wife's medical care." I guided him to a corner table, noting how he moved with the compliance of someone who'd been trained not to resist authority. Once we were seated, I opened the envelope and spread the documents across the table. "Do you recognize this?" I showed him the payment record from Clarice's foundation to the pharmaceutical company. "It's a $500,000 payment your mother made to the company that supplies the medications Dr. Wilkins has been giving Abigail." Randy stared at the document, his brow furrowed as if the words weren't quite making sense. "Mother handles all the financial arrangements. She says it's too complicated for me to understand." "Randy, look at me." I reached across the table and gently touched his hand. "When was the last time you made a decision without asking your mother's permission first?" The question seemed to startle him. He opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again, a look of confusion spreading across his face. "I want to show you something else," I said, pulling out a copy of his own medical records that Margaret had obtained. "These are your prescriptions for the past 10 years. Do you remember ever feeling anxious before you started taking these medications?" He studied the papers with increasing intensity, and for the first time since I'd known him, I saw something resembling independent thought in his expression. I remember being different in college, more confident. I had friends, I made decisions about my major, my activities. He looked up at me with growing alarm. What happened to that person? I think your mother has been controlling you through medication, just like she's controlling Abigail. Randy, I need you to understand something very important. Your wife and your baby are in danger. I showed him the documents about the Swiss medical facility, about Dr. Wilkins's suspicious history, about the pattern of pregnancy losses among Clarice's previous victims. With each piece of evidence, I watched Randy's expression change from confusion to horror to something that looked like rage. She made Sarah lose her baby, he whispered, referring to his cousin's wife. I always wondered, Sarah was so healthy and then suddenly… He looked at me with eyes that were clearer than I'd seen them in months. Is she planning to hurt Abigail? I think she's already started. The supplements Dr. Wilkins has been giving Abigail, the special vitamins your mother insists she take, I think they're designed to create complications that will justify more aggressive medical intervention. Randy's hands were shaking now. She told me yesterday that Dr. Wilkins thinks Abigail might need to be hospitalized soon for monitoring. She said the baby's heart rate has been irregular. My blood ran cold. Randy, we need to get Abigail away from Dr. Wilkins immediately. Can you help me? I don't know how. Mother monitors everything. She tracks our phones, our credit cards, our movements. If I try to take Abigail somewhere without permission, she'll know within minutes. What if we created a situation where your mother couldn't object? A medical emergency that required immediate attention from a different doctor? Randy's eyes widened. You mean fake a crisis? Not fake. Create legitimate concern that would justify getting Abigail to a real hospital with real doctors who aren't on your mother's payroll. I leaned forward intently. Randy, how much of your anxiety medication did you take this morning? The usual dose. 2 pills with breakfast like I have for years. He paused, processing the implication of my question. Why? Because I need you to think clearly for the next few hours, and those medications are designed to prevent that. Is there any way you could avoid taking your afternoon dose? Mother usually brings it to me at the office around 3. She says, it helps with my work stress. The realization of how controlled his life had become was written across his face. I could tell her I already took it. Good. And Randy, I need you to pay attention to everything that happens for the rest of today. Notice things you might normally ignore. Question things that seem strange or unusual. Can you do that? He nodded, and I could see determination building behind his eyes. What about Abigail? How do we get her away from Mother without making her suspicious? Leave that to me. I have a plan, but I need you to be ready to support Abigail when I put it into motion. She's going to be confused and frightened, and she'll need you to be strong for her. When? Tonight. Your mother will be at her charity gala until late. It's our best chance. I gathered the documents and stood up. Randy, everything you thought. You knew about your life, about your mother's motivations, about your marriage. Most of it has been a lie designed to keep you compliant and dependent. Are you ready to fight for your real life? For the first time since I'd known him, Randy looked me directly in the eyes with complete focus and clarity. Yes, I'm ready to fight. As I left the restaurant, I called Margaret to set the final phase of our plan in motion. By tonight, either we would have saved Abigail and Randy, or we would have triggered a confrontation that could destroy any chance of getting them back. But doing nothing was no longer an option. Sometimes the only way to save someone is to risk everything. At 7:30 that evening, I stood outside Abigail and Randy's house, my hands trembling as I pressed the doorbell. Through the window, I could see warm light spilling from the living room, and for a moment, it looked like the cozy home my daughter had always dreamed of. But I knew better now. This wasn't a home, it was a carefully constructed prison. Randy answered the door, and I was relieved to see that his eyes were clearer, more focused than they'd been at lunch. He'd managed to avoid his afternoon medication, and the difference was remarkable. "She's in the kitchen," he said quietly, stepping aside to let me in. "I told her you called about returning something you borrowed. She's confused but willing to see you." I found Abigail sitting at the kitchen island, slowly sipping a cup of tea. She looked up when I entered, and my heart broke at her appearance. She was pale and drawn, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of poor sleep and constant stress. Her 7-month belly looked somehow wrong, too small, too tight, as if her body was struggling to nourish the baby growing inside. "Mom?" Her voice was uncertain, tentative. "Randy said you wanted to return something?" I sat down across from her, noting the tremor in her hands as she held the teacup. "Sweetheart, I need to talk to you about something very important. About your health and the baby's health." Immediately, her expression shifted to the defensive posture I'd come to recognize. "Clarice and Dr. Wilkins are taking excellent care of us. I don't need Abby." I used her childhood nickname deliberately, hoping to break through the programming. "Do you remember when you were 8 and you got that terrible stomach flu? You were so sick you couldn't keep anything down for 3 days. A flicker of confusion crossed her face. What does that have to do with anything? Do you remember what I did? How I stayed awake for 3 nights straight, giving you tiny sips of water every few minutes, watching your temperature, holding you when you cried?" "Of course. But..." "And do you remember what you said to me when you finally felt better? You said, 'Mommy, you saved my life. You're the best mom in the whole world, and I'm going to love you forever.'" I reached across the table and took her hand. "That was real, Abby. That love, that bond. It was real." Tears began to well up in her eyes. "I remember. But things are different now. I've learned so much about proper family dynamics, about what healthy relationships look like." "From who?" "From Clarice?" I pulled out the manila envelope I'd brought. "Abby, I need you to look at something. This is a financial record showing that Clarice paid $500,000 to a pharmaceutical company that supplies experimental pregnancy medications." Abigail stared at the document, her brow furrowing. "I don't understand. What does this have to do with me?" Randy sat down beside his wife, his voice gentle but urgent. "The same company supplies the medications Dr. Wilkins has been giving you, the ones that Clarice insists you take. Those are just vitamins and supplements. Clarice explained that they're specially formulated for high-risk pregnancies." "High risk?" I leaned forward. "Abby, your pregnancy was perfectly normal until you started seeing Dr. Wilkins. Do you remember? Your first doctor said everything looked great." Something flickered in her eyes, a memory trying to surface. "Dr. Peterson. I liked her. But Clarice said she wasn't experienced enough for a Mitchell family baby. Abby, Dr. Peterson delivered over 3,000 babies. She's one of the most respected obstetricians in Boston." I showed her another document. "This is Dr. Wilkins's medical history. He's been investigated twice for causing complications in pregnancies." Abigail's hands started shaking more violently. "No, that's not. Clarice wouldn't. She loves me. She's been more of a mother to me than..." She stopped abruptly, looking stricken. "Than I ever was?" I finished gently. "Abby, that's exactly what she wanted you to believe. It's part of how she controls people. She convinces them that their real family doesn't love them enough, doesn't understand them, isn't sophisticated enough to guide them properly." Randy took his wife's other hand. "Honey, my mother has been giving me anxiety medication for 10 years. Medication I didn't need, that made me foggy and compliant. Just like she's been doing to you with these pregnancy supplements. That's impossible. She's your mother. She loves you. Does she?" Randy's voice was stronger than I'd ever heard it. When was the last time she asked what I wanted instead of telling me what I needed? When was the last time she supported a decision I made independently? Abigail opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. I could see her trying to think of an example and failing. Abby, I want you to think about something, I said softly. Before you married Randy, what did you want to do with your life? I was a pediatric nurse. I loved working with children. And now? Clarice helped me understand that working outside the home isn't appropriate for a Mitchell wife. That my focus should be on family and social responsibilities. But is that what you wanted or what she told you to want? The question hung in the air like a challenge. I watched my daughter struggle with concepts that had been systematically erased from her thinking. The idea that her own desires mattered, that she had the right to make choices about her own life. I've been so tired lately, she whispered, and confused. Sometimes I can't remember things clearly. Clarice says it's normal pregnancy brain, but it's gotten worse since you started taking her supplements, Randy finished. Abigail looked at her husband with growing alarm. How do you know about the supplements? Because I've been watching more carefully today. Really watching, instead of just going through the motions like I have for years. He pulled out his phone. Abby, look at this. He showed her a photo he'd taken of the pills Clarice had brought her that morning. I looked these up. This one is supposed to be a prenatal vitamin, but it's actually a mild sedative. This one is labeled as iron supplement, but it's a drug. Used to suppress appetite and cause nausea. Abigail stared at the phone screen, her face draining of color. She's been drugging me? We think she's been creating artificial pregnancy complications to justify more invasive medical care, I said gently. Abby, we found evidence that she's planning to move you and Randy to a private medical facility in Switzerland. Once you're isolated from everyone who really loves you. Oh, God. Abigail suddenly bent forward, clutching her stomach. I think I'm going to be sick. Randy was instantly at her side, supporting her as she dry-heaved into the sink. When the spasms passed, she looked up at us with terror in her eyes. What has she done to my baby? If she's been giving me drugs, what has she done to my baby? We don't know yet, I said honestly, but we're going to find out, and we're going to make sure you get real medical care from doctors who aren't on Clarice's payroll. Abigail sank into Randy's arms, finally allowing herself to feel the fear and confusion she'd been suppressing for months. I've been so scared, she whispered. But every time I tried to question anything, she made me feel like I was being ungrateful and paranoid. That's called gaslighting, Randy said, his voice full of newfound understanding. She's been doing it to both of us for years. I watched my daughter and son-in-law hold each other, finally seeing their situation clearly for the first time. But even as relief flooded through me, I knew our most dangerous moment was still ahead. We need to get you to a real hospital tonight, I said urgently, before Clarice realizes what's happening. Abigail nodded, her hand protectively over her belly. Yes. I want real doctors to examine the baby. I want to know what she's done to us. As we gathered her things and prepared to leave, I felt a surge of hope stronger than anything I'd experienced since the baby shower. My daughter was finally awake, finally fighting back. Now we just had to survive Clarice's reaction when she discovered what we'd done. Massachusetts General Hospital at 9 p.m. was a controlled chaos of emergency medicine. But Dr. Sarah Chen, the obstetrician Margaret had arranged to meet us, cut through the noise with calm efficiency. She was younger than I'd expected, with intelligent eyes and the kind of steady presence that immediately inspired confidence. I've reviewed the preliminary blood work we took when you arrived, she said, sitting across from Abigail in the consultation room. I need to be direct with you about what we've found. Abigail gripped Randy's hand tighter, and I saw the fear in both their faces. After years of accepting Clarice's version of reality, They were terrified of learning the truth. The supplements you've been taking contain several concerning substances, Dr. Chen continued. Primarily, there's a compound that inhibits nutrient absorption, which explains your fatigue and the baby's smaller size. There's also a mild anticoagulant that could cause bleeding complications during delivery. She was trying to hurt the baby? Abigail whispered. I think she was creating conditions that would justify emergency medical intervention, Dr. Chen replied carefully. The combination of drugs wouldn't necessarily cause permanent harm, but they would create symptoms that could be used to justify more aggressive treatment. Randy's jaw clenched. Treatment from Dr. Wilkins. Exactly, and based on the timeline you've described, I believe the plan was to induce complications that would require you to be hospitalized under his care, possibly for the remainder of your pregnancy. Margaret Torres, who had been quietly taking notes in the corner, looked up. Doctor, in your professional opinion, would these medications be detectable in routine blood work? Not unless you knew specifically what to look for. The compounds are sophisticated and would be easily missed in standard prenatal testing. I felt a chill as I realized how carefully orchestrated Clarice's plan had been. How long before the effects wear off? With proper nutrition and medical support, we should see improvement within a few days. The baby's growth should normalize, and Mrs. Mitchell should start feeling much stronger. As Dr. Chen left to prepare Abigail's treatment plan, Margaret pulled out her phone. I've been in contact with Detective Morrison. He's prepared to file charges against Clarice for assault and conspiracy, but we need more evidence. What kind of evidence? Randy asked. A confession, ideally. Something that clearly demonstrates intent to harm and control. Margaret looked at me meaningfully. The recording device we discussed. I touched the brooch on my jacket, the tiny recorder that had been waiting for its moment. She'll be furious when she finds out we brought Abigail here. If I can get her to explain why she did what she did. It's dangerous, Randy said immediately. When my mother feels cornered, she becomes vicious. I've seen her destroy people who crossed her. That's exactly why we need this recording, Margaret replied. People like Clarice can't resist the opportunity to justify their actions, especially when they feel their intelligence is being questioned. Abigail looked up from the hospital bed where she was receiving IV fluids. I want to help. I want to be there when you confront her. Absolutely not, I said firmly. You need to stay here where you're safe, where the baby is safe. But she's controlled my life for 2 years. Don't I deserve to face her? Randy took her hand. We'll face her together, but not until we know you and the baby are completely healthy. Let your mother handle this part. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text message. She read it quickly, her expression growing tense. Clarice just left the charity gala early. She's apparently been trying to reach both of you for the past hour. How long before she figures out we're here? I asked. Not long. Hospital security has been alerted, but Clarice has a lot of influence in this city. We need to act fast. Dr. Chen returned with a night nurse who began setting up monitoring equipment for Abigail. I'm keeping her overnight for observation, she explained. Given what she's been through, I want to make sure both mother and baby are stable before discharge. Perfect, Margaret said. That gives us the justification we need for why she's here. Roberta, are you ready to make that call? I looked at my daughter, finally receiving proper medical care, finally free from the fog of manipulation and drugs. Then I looked at Randy, clearer and more determined than I'd ever seen him. I'm ready. Margaret handed me a script she'd prepared. Remember, the goal is to get her to admit what she's been doing and why. Let her think she's won, that she's smarter than all of us. Narcissists can't resist explaining their superiority. I dialed Clarice's number, my heart pounding as it rang. Roberta? Her voice was sharp with barely controlled fury. Where is my son? Where is Abigail? They're not answering their phones. They're with me, I said calmly. At Mass General. Abigail had some complications. A pause. What kind of complications? The kind that happen when someone has been systematically poisoned for months. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 30 seconds. When Clarice finally spoke, her voice had transformed into something cold and calculating. I think we need to have a conversation. 20 minutes later, I sat in the hospital cafeteria across from Clarice Mitchell, the recording device in my brooch capturing every word. She looked impeccable as always, despite having left her charity gala early. Her silver hair perfectly styled, her designer dress unwrinkled, her jewelry catching the harsh fluorescent lights. But there was something different in her eyes, a coldness that she'd never let me see before. "You have no idea what you've done," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of absolute fury. "The damage you've caused to this family." "The damage I've caused?" I kept my voice steady, remembering Margaret's coaching. "Clarice, your son and daughter-in-law are upstairs getting treatment for the effects of drugs you've been giving them for months." "Supplements," she corrected smoothly. "Carefully formulated supplements designed to ensure the healthiest possible pregnancy outcome." "Supplements that caused malnutrition and bleeding risks?" Clarice's laugh was like ice-breaking. "Do you have any idea how expensive those compounds were? How much research went into developing them? I spent a fortune ensuring that Abigail would have exactly the pregnancy experience she needed." "Needed for what?" "For her to understand her limitations, obviously." Clarice leaned forward, and for the first time I saw the mask slip completely. That girl walked into my family thinking she could just take over, thinking her little nursing degree and her middle-class values made her suitable to raise a Mitchell heir. I felt my blood pressure rising but forced myself to stay calm. "So you decided to control her pregnancy?" "I decided to teach her some much-needed humility. A woman in her position needs to understand that she's not capable of making important decisions about her child's welfare." Clarice's voice carried the conviction of someone who truly believed what she was saying. The complications would have made her grateful for proper guidance, dependent on people who actually know what they're doing. And if the complications had been worse? If something had happened to the baby? Clarice's smile was chilling. Well, that would have been tragic, of course. But it also would have eliminated the problem of an unsuitable mother trying to raise a child she wasn't equipped to handle. The casual way she discussed potentially killing my grandchild made my hands shake with rage. "Just like what happened to Sarah's baby? And the other woman you did this to?" "Sarah was weak," Clarice said dismissively. "She couldn't handle the pressure of being part of a superior family. The pregnancy loss was unfortunate, but it revealed her true character. She wasn't Mitchell material. You killed those babies. I created situations that revealed whether these women were worthy of the positions they'd been given." Her voice rose slightly, and I could see the narcissistic pride that Margaret had warned me about. "Do you understand the level of sophistication required to manage something like this? The connections, the resources, the planning? The corruption of doctors, you mean? The utilization of medical professionals who understand the bigger picture? Dr. Wilkins knows that sometimes individual outcomes must be sacrificed for family stability." She leaned back, looking almost pleased with herself. "You could never comprehend the complexity of managing a family legacy like ours." "And Randy? Your own son?" "Randy needed structure. He was always too emotional, too impulsive. The medication helped him focus on what really mattered: family loyalty, proper behavior, appropriate decisions." Her tone suggested she was discussing training a pet rather than raising a child. "Everything I did was for his own good." "For 10 years, you've been drugging your own son. I've been ensuring his success and happiness. Before the medication, he was making terrible choices. Wrong friends, wrong career interests, wrong romantic attachments. The anxiety medication helped him see clearly. I thought about the confident, outgoing young man Randy had been in college, systematically destroyed by his own mother. And now, with Abigail? Abigail was a test case. If she could be properly molded, she might have been suitable. But her stubborn attachment to you, her resistance to proper guidance. Clarice shook her head. Some people simply can't be elevated beyond their natural limitations. So you were planning to take them to Switzerland? Clarice's eyebrows rose slightly in surprise. You've been busy. Yes, the Swiss facility would have provided the kind of intensive care Abigail needed. Away from disruptive influences, with proper medical supervision, she might have learned to be grateful for the opportunities she'd been given. Or she would have died there, like the others. If someone can't adapt to a better life, perhaps they don't deserve one. The casual cruelty in her voice was breathtaking. Survival of the fittest applies to social evolution as well as biological evolution. I looked at this woman who had terrorized my daughter, drugged her son, and casually discussed murdering babies as if it were a business decision. The recording device was capturing every word, every admission of guilt, every revelation of her twisted worldview. The only thing I regret, Clarice continued, is that your interference has forced me to accelerate my timeline. I had hoped for a more elegant resolution. What do you mean? Her smile was cold and calculating. I mean that hospital security is already being notified that a mentally unstable woman has kidnapped a pregnant patient and her husband. I mean that my lawyers are already filing emergency custody motions. I mean that by tomorrow morning, you'll be in jail and Abigail will be back under proper medical supervision. She stood up, smoothing her dress. You see, Roberta, this is what happens when people like you try to interfere with people like me. You simply don't have the resources to win. As she walked away, I sat frozen for a moment, realizing that our confrontation was far from over. Getting the confession was only the beginning. Now we had to survive her counterattack. I didn't wait for Clarice's threats to materialize. The moment she left the cafeteria, I was on the phone with Margaret, who immediately contacted Detective Morrison. The recording was uploaded to a secure server within minutes, copies sent to the district attorney's office, and emergency protective orders filed before Clarice could reach her lawyers. By midnight, she was in custody. The next few hours were a blur of police interviews, medical consultations, and legal proceedings. Dr. Chen confirmed that both Abigail and the baby were responding well to treatment, the dangerous compounds already being flushed from their systems. Randy, finally free from his medication fog, was like a man waking up from a decade-long nightmare. I remember who I used to be, he told me as we sat in Abigail's hospital room, watching her sleep peacefully for the first time in months. I remember having opinions, making choices, feeling like my life belonged to me. The trial, 6 months, later made headlines across New England. Dr. Wilkins turned state's evidence in exchange for a reduced sentence, revealing the full scope of Clarice's operation. She had been systematically targeting and controlling vulnerable women for over 15 years, using a network of corrupt medical professionals and legal advisors to maintain her schemes. The Swiss facility was raided and shut down. Sarah, Judy's daughter, flew in from Oregon to testify, finally getting the justice she'd been denied years earlier. Other victims came forward, women who had been too terrified or too isolated to speak up before. Clarice was sentenced to 25 years in prison for multiple counts of assault, conspiracy, medical fraud, and attempted murder. But the real victory happened 3 months after the trial, on a crisp January morning when I held my healthy grandson for the first time. James Robert Mitchell Campbell, named for both his grandfathers, was perfect in every way, with his mother's intelligent eyes and his father's gentle smile. "Thank you," Abigail whispered as she watched me rock him, "for never giving up on me, for seeing through her lies when I couldn't." "You don't need to thank me for loving you," I replied. "That's what mothers do, real mothers." Randy, clear-eyed and confident now, was building his own law practice specializing in family protection cases. "I want to help other people who've been through what we experienced," he explained. "No one should have to face this kind of manipulation alone." Today, as I write this, Abigail has returned to nursing, pediatric care naturally, and she and Randy have moved into a house they chose themselves, far from Beacon Hill and all its toxic memories. They make their own decisions now, sometimes asking for advice, but never for permission. Clarice still sends letters from prison, attempts to maintain contact disguised as grandmother's concern. We return them unopened, because we learned something important through this ordeal. Real love doesn't require control. Real family doesn't demand the destruction of other relationships. Real bonds grow stronger when tested, not weaker. Sometimes people ask me how I knew to keep fighting when everything seemed hopeless. The answer is simple. I knew my daughter. Beneath all the manipulation and drugs and psychological conditioning, I could still see the little girl who had once promised to love me forever. Some foundations cannot be broken. Some connections cannot be severed. Some love cannot be manipulated away. The land between us, both literal and metaphorical, had been contested, fought over, nearly stolen. But in the end, it remained ours, stronger than ever, ready for the next generation to build upon. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.